So in this video I want to talk about if like classical architecture, let's say the classicistic architecture style, is like applicable in 21st century. So in other words, if we can or should build like in classic or classicistic architecture nowadays. So the classicism or classical architecture mostly mean that it goes back to the original Greek architecture, like this is a Greek temple, right? In this case a Doric temple. So, and there were like different approaches to go back to classic ancient architecture, so mainly we mean the Greek and the Roman architecture. So this building that we see is from like early 19th century, so I think it's a bank building in America. So there were kind of the two most like famous approaches to like go back to the Greek and Roman classic architecture is of course the Renaissance, and then what I show here, the time so-called Classicism, so the time, let's say around 1800, when people after the Baroque were like tired of this kind of Baroque too rich ornaments, and they wanted to go back to the Greek classic architecture. So here we see the porticos, similar like that original Greek temple, like of a Doric temple, and then added to this bank building, and on the pure window arrangement of the side. So this has no reference, and it doesn't look like the Greek temples, right? But it's still like is quite a pure arrangement of windows. So this is this kind of strict classicism around 1800. I made another video about that. Here is another building from America. This is an unknown architect, where you see already how he like composed like a new composition based on this Greek element. So in the original Greek temples we do not have these side porticos that we see on the side, just like two columns added to the big volume. But here you see the Greek elements were like used in a more or less pure way, and that's called classicism, right, around 1800. And just to shortly mention this very important and famous architect, Jean-Etienne Boullée, that I also mentioned in my other video, he like drove that further already, this Greek self-understanding of architecture, and actually I think it's kind of the most modern architects like of all time, like looking backwards from now. So he like abstract the form already like to nearly abstract cubic shapes, and the column, as you can see, is not like one element anymore that's like countable. It's just like becomes like a perforation of the cube, right? So here this is kind of a long window, if you want, like that, and this kind of the column is not like a single element anymore. It becomes just like, well, basically perforation of the flat wall. And this whole like works out the geometric elements a lot, which then later Le Corbusier, as a famous architect, I think he got his form developments from Boullée, or like this like interior. These are like theoretical works, right? He was also a university teacher in France in the 18th century. And so this is this kind of called radical classicism, or also revolutionary classicism, which is actually wrong because it was before the French Revolution and during the Baroque monarchic time, actually, in France. So, and then we have another approach of classicism. So this is from Hamburg, architect called Hansen. So you use these kind of these kind of elements around 1800, for example, the Greek classical elements, to compose something new, right? But still like in a very pure way. In the later times of the 19th century, it become like more elaborated, and again to like neo-Gothic, neo-Rococo, neo-Baroque, and so on. So this time around 1800, this building's from I think 1820 or something. It's, by the way, the building where that architect called Hansen lived himself and had his architect office there behind that window. So in Hamburg, and so they still create something new, but it's pretty like strict. This is the same architect, Hansen. This is a town hall in northern Germany designed by him. And you see it's very pure already. There's nearly no ornament. The most ornament is basically around the two windows. And you see there's just very pure columns. And it's a very abstract usage already of the Greek classic language. That's also around 1800 something. This is also in Hamburg, a house designed by the same architect, a villa in the Palmai Street. That's the name of it. It's still like existing. It's a contemporary photo, and you see like how pure it was already. The Greek architectural language is used. So this is not like stripped off. It was like that originally. So there's nothing like removed later. It's really just these like very fine elements to indicate the upper entablature, to close actually the whole building. And here you see like there's no ornament in the first floor, and actually the columns here, the Ionic columns, stand pretty well, already a bit lonely-like in that facade. So a very pure usage of it. That's another house I showed before, also in Hamburg. I just want to show you how elegantly you can use this kind of classic language to create, for example, houses. So here the Greek Doric column is just used in the porticos, right, to mark the entrance, and the rest of the house is also follows the Greek self-understanding of like, yeah, this is quite a pure approach to like classic architecture, and just want to show like how elegant you can design housing. I mean, like this could be also built like nowadays like that, right? So it's like a pretty elegant form of doing classical architecture basically. And this is another one designed by the famous Berlin architect Schinkel, Carl Friedrich Schinkel. So this was actually for the royal family, so it's like a very small form. It's not a palace, it's more like a garden house. And you see like how pure the facade is designed. This is an old photo from the same building from the perspective. So you see already how pure he used the classical language and already create something new by using these like pilasters. It's not really pilaster. It's actually pilaster in the corner, and then just like two very pure and quite free designed columns, and the rest is just this cubic form. So it's already a pretty modern approach around 1800 something in Berlin. And then I want to continue. So there's a third like approach to classicism or redoing classical architecture in the early 20th century, and this what we see here is actually the first building. That's why I show that to this what they call in English stripped classicism. So here you see in the old form there was like a statue on top, this kind of horse that was removed during First World War, and the whole building I think was built 1913, I believe 1913. It's in St. Petersburg, I think. It was designed by the German architect Peter Behrens, who is like very important anyway for architecture history development, and he invented this kind of very pure form of classicism, which was later adopted in other countries, and unfortunately also by the totalitarian regimes of like Hitler and Mussolini. That's why it's a bit like discredited. So as I said, it's from 1913, so it's much older than the totalitarian states later, but at least older than the Nazi regime, which started like 1933, so 20 years before that. But these forms later were used by Hitler and Mussolini, and that's why after the war nobody wanted to use them anymore. So, and this is just an example that other countries also adopted that style from Peter Behrens. So this is actually in Finland, and there's a contemporary photo, and you see already it's like a free design of this kind of roof segment, and a very in English, in America they call stripped classicism, so very stripped off form of Greek classical architecture. This is also 1910s or 20s, I think early 20s in Finland. And here another example. This is already Mussolini, so they adopted the style. Hitler more representative and Mussolini a bit more reduced and pure. This is I think a post office in Italy during the Mussolini regime. This is the university in Rome, La Sapienza, and you see already a very pure, pretty modern approach, but still like using this classical self-understanding of architecture. This is the famous example from the EUR quarter in Rome or outside of Rome that also Mussolini ordered to build, and here you see like how pure and modern these classic forms already are translated, so into like basically a modern building. But in America they did it too. So this building is from America, 1920s or 30s, I believe. I forgot what that actually is. And this I showed another video already. Kind of my most beloved building in France. So the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, which is designed surprisingly by a group of architects, so not just one, and used already this kind of classic self-understanding of Greek architecture. But as you see, the proportions are like completely like independent from the Greek classical orders, so it has nothing to do with Doric, Ionic or Corinthic in the system of making the proportions. So the columns are very thin, the entablature is also very thin. It has to be usually slim. So when you make the columns slimmer, you need to make the entablature more thin, and also the distances between the columns more narrow, which has happened here, otherwise it looks weird. You can try that out by yourself. So the more fat the columns are, the wider the distances between the columns look better, and the entablature needs to grow with the thickness of the columns. So here very slim columns are used in the 1920s and 30s in this kind of pure form of classicism, and thus then very thin entablature and a very free design, as you can see here. And this is just like, now we go to the question of like contemporary classicism. So this was built in the early 2000s, I think, in England, and it's like a small garden villa, and you see he uses the Doric porticos in front of this very cubic building, and so you see the front is like strictly Greek classicistic proportions, just with actually Roman Doric. It's actually a Roman Doric order, because the columns are like have the columns are the Roman Doric columns, and also the entablature is modified to be the Roman Doric one. But as you can see, so it looks pretty okay, but clearly you can see it's like 21st century classicism already in its like pure definition. Also this one I think is in, where is it? Is it England? It looks like England, right? So this is another like example where you see like a classic Greek porticos in front of a also classic but newly built building in the early 2000s. And that leads us to like few famous architects who like talk about classical architecture. So this is actually like Leon Krier. Rob and Leon Krier are two like Belgium architects who like proclamate a lot this like new classic architecture. And so this is like all new buildings that you can see here, and you see there's no clear reference to like Greek elements in this case. Here's a Palladian motif in this building, and so this is already, we can call a form of postmodernism. So this is a photo from Poundbury, a small city in England, ordered also by now King Charles, that time like Prince Charles, who kind of ordered Leon Krier, beside other like not just that time Prince Charles, but also him like supported this kind of small city, Poundbury in England, completely built in this kind of, it's actually a postmodern approach in this like classic style. There's another photo from Poundbury. So the whole city is like designed like from scratch newly, but it looks like, as you can see, around 1800. Also this is Leon Krier, I believe. You see fire station with the, okay, and then another way how I think it's like critical to discuss if this is still classicism. So this is Philip Johnson, I think 1960s even. So I mean, I would call it like a modern building from 1960s, but he like refers with these arcs, and also in other works Philip Johnson did that. Later he even built like postmodern, but that was before the postmodern time in the 1960s. A square in New York, and also that building some people refer to as like classicistic reference. I mean, no, there's a connection to like classical architecture, but clearly it's like a modern 1960s building. It stands just here on the side next to the Philip Johnson building. I forgot the architect. It's not Philip Johnson, but built at the same time. And we see another, I want to show another example how I think you should not do it. So this is like obviously like too abstract. So we take the idea of a classic porticos in front of a very cubic, I mean actually a cubic building, and I think so this is like, I think too much of like stripping off. So this architect in my opinion has gone too far. And so this is then like the opposite approach. This is like clearly postmodern, I think 1980s or 90s. This is Rob Krier, so the brother of Leon Krier, who designed Poundbury. My goodness, I mean, I think this is like a bit too much. So in my opinion, like this is classical architecture how it should not be. And I want to skip like the real like extreme postmodernism here, because I will do this in another lecture. This is a famous architect, Hans Koloff in Berlin. This was the former headquarters of Mercedes-Benz at the Potsdam Square in Berlin. And you can see like Hans Koloff is an example. He was a professor at the ETH and thus had like a big influence on like spreading what he called classical architecture. But actually it doesn't really strictly go back to Greek architecture. It more looks in the 19th century, and he also say that. So in this case he said it goes back to the high-rise in Chicago, and he kind of used the formal language of the so-called first school in Chicago, to design this high rise, a bit more than 100 meter in Berlin. And this is another building of Hans Koloff in Berlin. So he doesn't strictly use like Doric, Ionic or so proportions from ancient times. He just like designs something looking like 19th century basically. Or here it's also Hans Koloff. He just details the facades more and not really referring back to any like classic proportions itself. So it's not really like classicistic architecture, but it refers back to 19th century basically. There's another example of himself in Frankfurt, Hans Koloff, a housing building in Frankfurt. And this is an example I really like, so I want to show this. This is an architect called Carsten Vogel in Berlin. He was a project manager of Hans Koloff before. And he, I think, uses like classical self-understanding, also without the correct and classical proportions of Doric, Ionic, and so on, columns from Greek and Roman language. So he does not use these classical proportions, but he designed villas. He has an office in Berlin now, so he was, as I said, an employee from Hans Koloff before, and has since a while already his own architecture practice and designed like villas in Berlin and also other parts of the world, already now South America, and so in this kind of classical style. But I mean, they like, let's say like people who do not know about architecture would say, okay, that looks classical, but it's not like classicistic in that definition because it doesn't use the Greek language. It's just like there's another villa. So I really like his approach of like detailing the facade more and make it like a very elegant and richly looking building without using the classical columns and elements itself. It's also not very decorated, so here you see this frieze. But other buildings like this are really like very pure. So this refers, I think, mostly to the 1930s classicism that I introduced before, Palais de Tokyo and so on. So some people would link that to totalitarian architecture of Hitler and Mussolini and thus like not like it. But I think this is actually a not too bad way of like doing a contemporary building, and looks clearly modern, right? A contemporary building that on the other hand, like this is the back facade of the same building, looking elegant and timeless also, and it's not like Zaha Hadid or Gehry or something like blopping around. It's very honest, like tectonic architecture, and it's contemporary, but I would call it classical. So, and this is another like, I think more or less good example, but here we can see already more abstract. That's David Chipperfield, the British Architect Office. This is a Museum for Literature in Germany, and as you can see, he uses the classical. Well, this is not classical at all. It has nothing to do with like classicism in its original definition, but he uses the language. This is a museum for literature in the birth city of Friedrich Schiller, who was a classical author and writer. I mean, from around 1800. So that this kind of reference makes sense, and so it just like refers in its language to classical architecture, but does not use anything of the classical Greek or Roman proportions. This is another similar building which clearly refers to the first one. So the Museum for Literature won like many architecture prizes, and this is the new entrance building what we see now of the Museum Island in Berlin. And actually David Chipperfield proposed another design first with glass cubes before, which was like rejected from the public opinion because they say, why we need the glass cubes here? It's like a classical museums in the background, right? We see the part of the museum island in the background. So he changed his design referring to the Museum for Literature, and yeah, we see the similarity clearly. So this has nothing to do with classical proportion, but I think it's still like a well done approach. And maybe this is a bit too long here, this rows of it's actually not even columns, it's like pillars with a squared section. And so how should we do it? I think we should not like build again with these rich ornament and like copying old styles like Renaissance or Baroque or whatever architecture, but I think actually the approach they had in the 1930s to use the classical language, what that actually indeed is, I will make another video about. So what's actually classical language? I will discuss that in another video soon. And I think this kind of approach they had in the 1930s is already pretty good. So like using classical language to also like guarantee that houses actually like match together, not like modern architecture, everyone does what he wants. and also not like blopping around like Zaha Hadid stuff architecture. So doing something, let's say, proper, referring to classical appearance and also rules, but we do not need to copy the ornament detailedly necessarily, in my opinion.